Hey everyone, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is give a review and a summary of the book Jesus and the Disinherited by the theologian Howard Thurman. Before I get started, I want to start by asking three questions. Question number one, why is it that African Americans, who were enslaved by people who called themselves Christians, identify with the religion of Jesus and often at a higher rate than whites? Question number two, why was the civil rights movement in the United States dedicated to nonviolence? Question number three, why was the civil rights movement in the United States effective? If you're interested in either of these questions and you want to explore them, you should just basically stop watching this video and go ahead and go to your library or go to iBooks or Amazon or whatever and pick up a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman, because in less than 100 pages, Thurman addresses all three of these questions, actually. Now, he doesn't claim he's going to put these issues to rest entirely, but rather what he claims to do is to understand these in the context of, I guess, maybe his own experience and just in the context of Jesus himself, which is very, very interesting. So who is Howard Thurman? Howard Thurman wrote Jesus and the Disinherited in 1949. I'd consider him to be one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. He's a serious philosophical and analytic mind. He's also a philosopher. If you read this book, you can just tell this guy's analytic. I mean, he thinks like an engineer. It's really interesting to read it and to be like, wow, like this is like, I mean, he's a really, really interesting, deep thinking kind of guy. Just a smart dude. He was a valedictorian as an undergrad and in graduate school, and unfortunately, not as many people have heard of him. He was voted one of the 50 most important figures in African American history. I just learned that as doing, research for this video. So, interesting. But to give you an idea of how influential he was a spiritual mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. He was friends with Gandhi. Just really, really influential person. And this book was originally a series of lectures that he gave a bunch of times. And after the book was published, he continued giving these lectures. And this is the book that Martin Luther King Jr. kept in his briefcase during the Montgomery bus boycott. So obviously very, very important book. And I think if you read it, you will understand why it had such a huge influence on generations of theology, really. There was one sermon made in 2010. The guy said, Howard Thurman was 100 years ahead of us. And that was 50 years ago. So he's still 50 years ahead of us. So it's kind of funny. So really, it's a short book, 100 pages, and it's divided into 4 simple chapters. He starts off the book by asking the question, why is it that Christianity seems impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with the issues of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin? Is this impotency due to a betrayal of the genius of the religion, or is it due to a basic weakness in the religion itself? Ouch. I mean, he goes right out of the gate in the preface with this question. But I think it's a fair question. It's a valid question. The question he's trying to answer is, what does the religion of Jesus have to say for those what he calls the disinherited, those with their backs against the wall? Surprisingly, a lot. He thinks that the answer to this is the first option, that it was a betrayal of the genius of the religion. And he says, quote, it is the sin of pride and arrogance that has tended to vitiate the missionary impulse and to make it an instrument of self-righteousness on the one hand and racial superiority on the other. He gets asked this question in the introduction when he goes to India. Somebody asks him, look, I think you're a traitor. More than 300 years ago, your forefathers were taken from the western coast of Africa as slaves. The people who dealt in the slave traffic were Christians. One of your favorite Christian hymn writers, Sir John Newton, made his money from the sale of slaves to the New World. Basically, the name of one of the British slave vessels was Jesus. The men who bought the slaves were Christians, Christian ministers. Quoting the Christian apostle Paul, they gave the sanction of religion to the system of slavery. And then during all the period since then, you have lived in a Christian nation and where you've been segregated, lynched, and burned. Even in the church, I understand there is segregation. Thurman basically says, look, our subsequent discussion lasted for more than 5 hours, and it's this particular question that tended to spur him to write the book. So there are 4 chapters in the book: fear, deception, hate, and lastly, love. Of course, that's how you got to end it. And we'll just talk about each of these briefly, and then I'll give my thoughts about the book. So what he talks about when it comes to fear is he talks about how the disinherited learn to expect violence. He talks about psychological warfare. The fact that you end up feeling unsafe and insignificant. Even if it's untrue, it doesn't matter. If there's just been one time that you've been taught or there have been demonstrations that you, just as you interpret as being dismissive of your own life and your own value, you begin to think that your life doesn't matter. And he talks about this. Look, the threat of violence, not just violence, but the threat of violence within a framework of well-nigh limitless power is a weapon by which the weak are held in check. He says, there are few things more devastating than to have it burned into you that you do not count and that no provisions are made for the literal protection of your person. Now, not only is he talking about this in terms of segregation, but he relates this back to Jesus' time, and Jesus understood this as a Jew living under Roman rule, where Roman soldiers could kill Jewish people, and because they were the people who basically had political authority, they could do this, and there weren't really any repercussions necessarily for them doing this. And his point was Jesus can basically understand. He didn't come into the world as this king or was born into this super rich family. He was born to a poor family of kind of I guess you could say an oppressed group. And this gives context to the belief that that Jesus actually understood and experienced what this was like. What he says, the thing that Jesus offers is the awareness of being a child of God. He says the awareness of being a child of God tends to stabilize the ego and results in a new courage, fearlessness, and power. I have seen it happen again and again. So his point is there are things that are worse than death, things that can basically kill your soul. It's not death that he thinks is the worst thing to happen, because people can die. They can die a hero's death. They can die a legend. His concern is that people can die and feel like their life is meaningless. And what Jesus offers is a realization that being a child of God, you're basically infinite worth. You're infinite worth to God. So regardless of what anyone else thinks about you, basically, they're wrong. You have infinite value to God. Chapter 2, he talks about deception. So he talks about natural selection. He says, look, to survive, animals actually must end up deceiving one another. He talks about animals that learn to camouflage themselves, to basically trick each other. And he says this is problematic because this ends up becoming, for people who are disinherited, they have these excuses to use deception. But the issue here that can happen is you actually become a deception. So he says the penalty of deception is to become a deception with all sense of moral discrimination vitiated. One of the things he draws upon is he says, look, like, people feel that their life is held lightly because of how they're treated, and then they end up treating each other this way. You can be, if you're in, let's say, a minority class, and there's a dominant group that's treating you poorly, you begin to think your own life doesn't matter, or the lives of other people in your group doesn't matter, and this can encourage you to actually take advantage of other people, even in your own group. And he says Jesus offers another and a more difficult way, which is authenticity. Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Thurman says, what this does is, in the presence of an overwhelming sincerity on the part of the disinherited, the dominant themselves are caught with no defense, with the edge taken away from the sense of prerogative and from the status upon which the impregnability of their position rests. So this creates an option when people who are disinherited use authenticity. Basically, the strong have no excuse anymore. They can't be writing these people off as being deceit, because what happens is people who are in positions of power use the fact that the people who are that are weaker, they can use the excuse that the people who are weaker are always going to try to trick them to kind of keep them in this sort of cycle. And what Thurman is saying is, look, by being authentic, you end up taking away the power that's used to basically control you. And he talks about this too. Any man who knows exactly what epithet he could hurl at you, anything he can do to get you to lose your temper, basically, can always keep you under control. He always has a way to subjugate you. So there's this idea of just inner peace that you need to develop, and part of that inner peace comes out as authenticity. Then we get to what seems to be the longest chapter in the book, which is hate. And he talks about the function and the effect of hatred. He talks about how the fact we create rationalizations for how we treat others. But one of the things he talks about is hate often simmers under the surface. It only turns into violence when we feel a sense of self-righteousness. So he talks about if validation or prestige are provided, the immoral or amoral character of hatred is transformed into positive violence. And he talks about how people actually use their hatred basically to give themselves a sense of significance. They can use their hatred of somebody else, especially people who treat them poorly as a way to feel better about themselves. The problem is this creates a sense of self-righteousness, and it gives people an excuse not to have any moral accountability. It's inherently dehumanizing. He says, if a man's attitude is life-negating in his relationships with those to whom he recognizes no moral responsibility, his conduct is without condemnation in his own mind. He says, a whole group may be regarded as an exception, and thus one is relieved of any necessity to regard them as human beings. A Negro may say, if a man is white, he may be automatically classified as one incapable of dealing with me, as if he were a rational human being. Or it may just be the reverse. Such a mood, the mood of exception, operates in all sorts of ways. Now, this is from chapter 4, which is on love, but I think it's relevant to this chapter too. Now, how did Jesus basically deal with hatred? That's the question we're going to ask. He says, look, love your enemies, that you may be children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. Now, why does he say this? Thurman says, despite all the positive psychological attributes of hatred we have outlined, hatred destroys finally the core of the life of the hater. He says Jesus rejected hatred because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, and death to communion with his Father. So he's basically saying, look, Jesus rejected hate. This is what we have to do as well. And this was the turning point in moving the civil rights movement from being one of violent revolt into civil disobedience, nonviolent revolt. This is kind of what influenced his thoughts, and also, being buddies with Gandhi. And lastly, he ends the book with love. He talks about 3 different types of love. Love of those who are in your group, which you can relate to, which is relatively easy. Love to those in your group who sell out to the enemy. Now, this is much harder. And he talks about this would be like in Jesus' time, Jesus bringing Matthew in as a disciple. Matthew was a tax collector, and tax collectors at the time were seen as people who were taking advantage of other Jews. They were Jews who were selling out to the Romans to take advantage of other Jews. But he says this isn't the hardest because you maybe understand to a certain degree what their motivations are. Maybe you felt to a certain degree, if you were in that position, maybe you would have taken it too. But you do feel, some group of hatred or some level of hatred or indignation to these people, still have to love them. And lastly, the love of the person who is actually your enemy, the person you think is perhaps the oppressor or is the person that is putting you in this situation. And in Jesus' time, this would have been the Romans. And he talks about the Roman soldier that Jesus meets and the Roman soldier that comes face to face with Jesus. And Jesus, I think, heals his daughter, if I'm remembering correctly. Thurman talks about the fact that disaster can actually create opportunities for love. He says, during the Great Vanport, Oregon disaster, when rising waters left thousands homeless, many people of Portland, who prior to that time were sure of their white supremacy, opened their homes to Negroes, Mexicans, and Japanese. The result was that they were all confronted with the experience of universality. This is actually why Thurman thinks segregation itself is evil. It denies interactions between two freed souls. And I find this point actually very compelling. It's not that segregation is bad in practice, that separate but equal is not equal. It's that the premise of separate doesn't create equality because you're not able to sit down and talk to somebody face to face. You're not able to see them as a fellow human being. With segregation and these sorts of things, you just aren't having these sorts of interactions. And Thurman was very vocal about the fact that church should not be racially segregated, that Sunday mornings were the most segregated time of America. He was just totally against this, and I find his point very compelling. And he went on to start one of the first major interracial churches with the white pastor. It was very, very interesting. But I think you understand why he was so against segregation. I think this is to me, it's a very compelling point. And to offer this, to kind of give this context, we've heard of Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis was a musician who befriended and convinced dozens, if not hundreds, of KKK members to quit. And it includes a KKK grandmaster, who gave him his robe and asked him to basically be the godfather to his daughter. What Daryl Davis says, look, if you'd fix the ignorance, there's nothing to fear. There's nothing to fear, there's nothing to hate. There's nothing to hate, there's nothing or no one to destroy, and therefore there's only people to love. And if you look at what Thurman says, recognizing fear, deception, and hatred, each for what it is, and the chapters of this book, I think it's very clear that Daryl Davis seems to be influenced at least by either the same ideas or by Thurman directly. And to what I say, coincidence? I think not. Davis went to college at Howard University, and Thurman there was a dean there at the chapel for over a decade. Not at the same time. Davis was a student there after, but obviously Thurman was very influential to the school. So basically, if I'm going to give my thoughts of this book, obviously I love this book. It's a very, very, it's a very interesting book, a very thoughtful, thought-provoking book. I think it's honestly life-changing for a lot of people, and it influenced generations of theologians. So pros, it's that it's short, it's insightful yet challenging. I definitely thought there were some areas that challenged me to think about things in a new way. It's influential, yet I think it's still relevant because Thurman is getting at the heart of the problem. He doesn't think oppression is the problem in and of itself. He thinks the hatred and the dehumanization is a problem. And until we address those underlying issues, we're still going to continue to have problems. And I find this very compelling. And it's a great book. I mean, it's really worth your time reading it. You should totally read it. If there are any cons to the book, I guess the two things I'd say, first of all, it's short. You kind of wish it was longer, at least I did. But that's, I guess, part of its strength too. And lastly, it's not as well read by the public. So most theologians have probably read this book. If somebody goes to seminary, it's a very popular book to read. I was talking to one pastor, and she asked me what I was reading, and I told her this book, and she was like, "Oh yeah, that's a classic." And I'm like, "Really?" Because like most people, I think, haven't heard of this book or know that it's a classic. But trust me, it's definitely worth your time. It's definitely worth a read. If anything, just for the historical context of why it was so important and influential to the civil rights movement. But beyond that, it's just a great book. I mean, it's just a challenging, thought-provoking book. Thanks for watching. I will leave you with the quote by Howard Thurman. Do not ask what the world needs. Do what makes you come alive and go do it, because the world needs more people who have come alive. Have a good one. Go in peace.